The Call to Arms, a short story of a black slave who participated in the Civil War in search of freedom. Before we get into the narrative, we must put this story into a historical context to know the answer to the following question, which is the center of the main plot in the story I am telling right now. What were the reasons for the war between the industrial states of the North and the slaveholders of the South? Some argue that economic policies and practices played an important role, the protection of cultural values, the extension and reach of the federal government and, most importantly, the role of slavery within American society were some of the factors to consider when you listen to this story. Perhaps that is why this dramatic story about the desire to be free, the fight for civil rights and the challenges that this represented during slavery, knowing the role of black slaves during the American Civil War is important in this narrative to understand the real reasons for the outbreak of this conflict between the northern and southern states. Learning about the life of Alexander, the main character in this story, will shed light on this historical event that marked the life of the American nation and those who became part of it. It was the year 1863 and the country was torn apart by the Civil War. In the South, families were divided and the North fought to preserve the Union. But for Alexander, a young man born into slavery on a Virginia plantation, the war represented more than just a battle between two sides. It was a call to freedom for him, and all like him were eager to be free. Alexander had always known the weight of oppression. His family worked on the land of a wealthy plantation owner, enduring brutal hours under the scorching sun, their bodies marked by work they did not choose. But from a very early age, Alexander learned to read in secret. With books hidden in the corners of the fields and whispered lessons from his grandmother, he became a man with a dream, not just for his own freedom, but for the liberation of his people and the results of the Civil War that could offer him that possibility. When President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it was a spark that motivated thousands of enslaved blacks to dream of a freedom that many saw as far away. Alexander heard the news from a Union soldier passing by the plantation to deliver supplies. The proclamation declared that all slaves in the Confederate States were free, but Alexander knew that freedom was not taken for granted, but had to be fought for. At that moment, Alexander understood that freedom is only achieved if you fight for it, even if that meant sacrificing your life to achieve it. Alexander did not hesitate in what he had to do, and that night, after his family went to sleep, Alexander crept away from the plantation. The woods were dark, but his determination was stronger than any moonlight. Alexander knew that crossing Union lines would not be easy, his heart beat faster with each step towards his future, but with determination he overcame his fears to achieve his goals, which would forever change the lives of black people just like him. Alexander found his way to a Union camp in Maryland, where he enlisted in the United States Colored Troops. He was one of more than 180,000 black soldiers who would fight for the Union cause during the Civil War, knowing full well that he was not only fighting for the end of slavery, but for the dignity of his people, who for a long time were being repressed, mistreated and discriminated against by white slave owners. Their first battle came in the summer of 1863, at the Battle of Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The Union needed soldiers to attack the heavily fortified Confederate position, and the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first black regiment to fight in the war, was tasked with leading the charge. Alexander, now part of the 54th Regiment, stood with men who had once been slaves, some still in chains and others who had been free but never truly were. The thunder of artillery in the distance was deafening, but Alexander stood firm, his rifle gripped firmly in his hands. Make no mistake, the assault was brutal, with many blacks losing their lives. The Confederate forces were well entrenched, and the Union soldiers, many of whom had never seen combat, faced overwhelming odds. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment charged into a storm of gunfire. Alexander watched as men fell beside him, their dreams of freedom ending in the smoke and blood of the battlefield. But Alexander did not stop, for that desire to survive that every man has in the most difficult moments on a battlefield where preserving your life and that of your comrade in arms was your priority, because you were not only fighting for yourself, you were fighting for other black soldiers, who like him had the same dreams of freedom. For Alexander, every step forward was a challenge against the chains of his past, a declaration that his people would no longer live in the shadow of oppression. Although the Union forces were finally defeated at Fort Wagner, the bravery of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment inspired the nation. The sight of black soldiers fighting with unparalleled courage and honor demonstrated to the world that African Americans were not only capable of serving in the army, but were an integral part of the victory of the Union cause. Alexander, though wounded, survived the battle and continued to fight. For him there was no greater desire to achieve the freedom that had been denied him up to that point, because he had a different skin color. By the end of the war in 1865, Alexander had seen many losses, but he also witnessed the birth of a new America, one in which his people could finally dream of equality. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, had been ratified, but for Alexander and the men he fought with, the war was only the beginning of their fight for full freedom and civil rights in a nation whose white citizenry viewed blacks as second-class citizens less than human, and in some southern slave states treated them as such. As Alexander stood on the battlefield for the last time, he looked out over the lands he had fought to free, knowing that while his personal struggle was over, the fight for justice had only just begun. The war was over, but the journey was far from over for Alexander and his comrades. The day the Union flag flew proudly over the South, signaling the surrender of the Confederacy, was a moment of victory, but it also marked the beginning of an uncertain future for the newly freed black men and women of America. Alexander returned home to Virginia, the very land where he had once been a slave. The plantation that had once enslaved him now lay abandoned, the fields untended and quiet. But the world around him had changed. He was no longer a man in chains, he was free, but freedom was not simple. The scars of slavery, the weight of prejudice, and enduring resistance to black equality still lingered in the hearts of many, especially among white slaveholders who had no desire to share what the nascent American nation could offer its citizens. In the years following the Civil War, Alexander, like thousands of other black veterans, struggled to find his place in a society that had long denied him his humanity, had cut short every one of his dreams. Dreams and aspirations that as a free man he believed he had the right to pursue after the end of the Civil War, not knowing that for centuries, even now, he would have to face a far worse war, a war for racial equality that is still a part of the American mindset. The Reconstruction era promised a new beginning, with laws intended to give freedmen the right to vote, own land, and pursue education. But these promises were often met with violence, as white supremacy grew in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and other groups seeking to undo the progress made during the war. Make no mistake, Alexander faced hardships as he tried to navigate this new world. He sought work as a laborer, but many employers were hesitant to hire black men, especially those who had served in the Union Army. The South was trying to rebuild, but old racial hierarchies still clung to the land like persistent weeds. Despite the challenges, Alexander remained determined to achieve his dreams that every free man has. He joined local black communities, where churches and schools became pillars of hope and resilience. The men who had fought alongside him became his brothers in arms once again, supporting each other through the difficult years following the war. Together, they fought for education, for jobs, for the right to live with dignity. But Alexander discovered that dreams of freedom are one thing and being free is another, especially when the political climate in the South was hostile, and when Reconstruction came to an end, many of the hard-won gains for African Americans were reversed. The rise of Jim Crow laws further entrenched racial segregation, and African Americans found themselves once again fighting for the rights they had briefly won. However, Alexander was not a man to give up easily. He had fought for his freedom in battle, and now he would fight for it in the streets, in the courts, and in the hearts and minds of his fellow citizens to achieve racial equality. In the years that followed, Alexander saw many of his brothers in arms become leaders in the civil rights movement, advocating for full citizenship and equality. He would live to see the beginnings of the fight for justice continue, with the work of men and women who fought on the front lines of social change. Although he did not live to see the civil rights movement of the 1960s, he knew, Alexander, that his service, his sacrifice, and his faith in a free and just nation had laid the groundwork for a future that had not yet been realized, but was possible. The legacy left by Alexander, like that of thousands of other black soldiers, would never be forgotten, and this type of storytelling is necessary to ensure that this is the case. The memory of those who fought for freedom in the Civil War would become a cornerstone of the continuing struggle for equality, reminding future generations that the battle for justice and human dignity was a fight worth taking on, no matter the cost. Alexander had answered the call during the war and, although the fight would continue for generations, he had helped light the way forward. As the years passed, Alexander's life became a silent testament to the resilience of those who had fought, not just with weapons, but with unwavering hope. He often spoke to the younger generations of black men and women in his community, sharing stories of the war and the struggles that followed, but also instilling in them the belief that their fight was far from over. The battle for freedom is not only fought on the battlefield, he would say. It is fought in every home, every street, every school. It is fought every day with the courage to stand firm in the face of injustice. In the evenings, Alexander would sit on the porch of his home, his worn boots propped up on the steps, and watch the sun set over the land. The same land that had once kept him chained now held the promise of a future his ancestors could not have imagined. His children, and later his grandchildren, would carry his legacy with them as they navigated a world that was slowly changing. Although he had seen the cruelty of segregation and the weight of institutionalized racism, Alexander believed that each generation had the power to create change. At the turn of the 20th century, when the Great Migration began, Alexander's children moved north in search of better opportunities, like many African Americans who sought refuge from the oppressive social and economic structures of the South. They found work in factories, schools, and offices, and raised families in cities like Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. The legacy of freedom, though fragile and contested, was maintained in these migrations. The work Alexander had fought for during the war was not yet finished, but the seeds of progress he had planted in his family began to take root in these new communities. Alexander died in the late 1800s, but his name lived on in the stories of those who knew him. Their grandchildren would one day learn about their bravery in war, not only through history books, but through their family's own narrative. And as the civil rights movement of the 1960s gained momentum, many would look back on their generation, knowing that their fight for equality was built on the sacrifices of people like Alexander. The participation of black men like Alexander in the American Civil War was not just about fighting for freedom, it was about defining what it meant to be American and demanding the right to be fully recognized as equals in the nation they helped shape. Black soldiers fought not only for their own freedom, but for the freedom of all Americans, regardless of color. The war was won on the battlefield, but the fight for equality, justice, and recognition would continue for decades, a fight that would pass through the hands of countless ordinary people, many of whom, like Alexander, would never receive full recognition during their lifetime, but whose contributions would become the foundation for future victories. Alexander's legacy, woven into the fabric of American history, was not one of grand monuments or widespread fame. Instead, it was a quiet, enduring legacy passed down through the generations that inspired the fight for freedom, dignity, and equality continues, but it is in part thanks to the sacrifices of men like Alexander that the nation is moving closer to the ideals of justice for all. His story, and the stories of thousands like him, remind us that freedom is not a gift, it is something to be fought for, every day. Ladies and gentlemen, did you enjoy this work? Please subscribe to this channel, share this video, give it a thumbs up.